First films of the world's largest helicopter. At Lambert Field, St. Louis, the Navy unveils the brand new twin-engine Whirlaway.
Introducing the Air Force's XR-10, the newest thing in helicopter transport.
The Helicop Hut. The H-21 workhorse Whirlybird is carrying the Hut in this tactical Air Force demonstration of communication mobility.
Miracle of today, she's the reality of America's industrial tomorrow.
The news reports of the time were breathless with excitement. The arrival of the helicopter promised sky buggies for everybody, helicars that would cost no more than a medium-price automobile. The helicopters shown on those early 1940s newsreels were certainly revolutionary, but few realised at the time just how the arrival of those early Bell, Hiller, Piasecki and Sikorsky helicopters would transform so many areas of society. Helicopters became lifesavers. Millions of lives ultimately being saved by the air ambulances and search and rescue helicopters, while a myriad of industries were enriched by the helicopter's unique attributes. Today, the arrival of the next generation of rotorcraft could deliver something the early helicopter pioneers could only dream of: the ability to hail an air taxi to whisk you across town, all through a smartphone app. Welcome to Shephard Studio's Revolutions in Vertical Flight, brought to you in partnership with Bell. Over the course of 6 episodes, we are looking at the history of vertical flight and discover the key pioneers and revolutionary moments that created the rotorcraft industry we know today. And we consider the future revolutions, how next-generation rotorcraft will shape the future battle space, and hear how innovation underway today will enable the urban air mobility of tomorrow. Everyone has a mental image of those failed early attempts at creating a working helicopter. But what was that revolutionary leap? What was the breakthrough that took the helicopter from the wacky experimental machines of the early 20th century and made it a viable concept? Invariably, when we asked that question of helicopter experts and historians, the answer pointed us to the inventor of an entirely different class of aircraft altogether. Juan de la Cierva was a Spanish engineer and pilot that invented a new single-rotor type of aircraft that came to be called the autogiro. Still popular today, the autogiro uses an unpowered rotor in free autorotation to produce lift. Cierva's work on the dynamics of the rotor system would pave the way for the modern helicopter. This is Jeremy Graham, a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society.
Lots of rotary wing inventions can be found in the history books going back, I suppose, ultimately to Leonardo's air screw, which would never have worked, but that's by the by, really. The point is he had at least imagined a rotary wing solution. But the person that really, I think, made it work for us would be Cierva. Cierva started as a fixed-wing designer as a young man, moved to rotary wing as his vision as to how the stall could be avoided. So a lot of accidents had happened because of fixed-wing stalls. And he had the very simple notion that if the wing was always moving at a sensible speed, then it would never stall. And this would be a safe aircraft. His notion of a rotary wing aircraft was all well and good, but it took a while to really resolve how to make it work properly. His early attempts have all the appearance of experiment over science, and they didn't work very well. It wasn't powered, it was basically a rotating wing kite. It was not truly controllable. And he struggled with this for some time. Eventually managed to cotton on to the fact that as the aircraft begins to move forwards, you get an asymmetry of lift. So his rotors were very stiff in flap, and they had no lag motion. They were stiff in lag as well, and they had no controls, no direct controls at all. But the effect of that was that one blade is moving into wind, and on the other side of the rotor, the blade is moving out of wind. So one blade is going airspeed-wise faster than the other, so it lifts harder than the other one. So the aircraft tended to roll over, and he had a lot of accidents with the aircraft rolling over on takeoff. He resolved this in the end by putting a flapping hinge, making the rotor flexible in flap. So the blade that wanted to lift simply flapped up, and it flapped down again as it came round on the retreating side. At that stage, though, he was still relying on fixed-wing style aerodynamic controls. So the aircraft had vestigial wings on which were mounted ailerons. He had a tailplane with an elevator and a rudder. And until those, so the aircraft, because of its ability to fly extremely slowly, as long as the rotor was rotating, there was lift and it wasn't going to stall. So he could land at very, very low speeds, and he could get the aircraft off the ground at very low speeds as well. But at those speeds, the fixed-wing controls didn't work. You needed a fair amount of forward speed for the ailerons and the elevators and the rudder to really work. He persevered with that configuration right through the 20s.
De la Sierva moved to the United Kingdom in 1925, where he established the Sierva Autogiro Company. The patents he took out over the course of refining and improving the rotor system on his autogyro were later adopted by the pioneers of the helicopter.
Well, it could be seen in various forms, because his approach to industrialization was to get people who had a history in the business of aviation to join forces with him, and he sent letters to all sorts of people inviting them to share his invention. He took out many patents to protect his inventions, and in the early 1930s he made a giant leap forward, which was to realize that if you could tilt the rotor under command, then you could control aircraft pitch and roll. You didn't need the elevators or the ailerons. So he took the wings off, and you end up then with an aircraft where the pilot is able to move the rotor thrust vector by an enormous handle that he had in the cockpit, which actually tilted in pitch or roll or any combination the rotor head, and therefore the whole rotor. And by doing that, he finally had a completely controllable aircraft.
This was the first helicopter I acquired, by the way. This was the first helicopter I flew in the early 1960s, and when Westland decided to get rid of it in '69, I bought it.
Here is Elfyn ap Rhys, chairman of the Helicopter Museum in the southwest of England, which houses more than 80 helicopters and autogyros from around the world.
Collecting helicopters. What I say to people now is don't start collecting things, because you don't know where you're going to end up. Well, this is actually the world's oldest surviving helicopter, the Hafner R2, which was built in Austria in 1931 and came to England when Raoul Hafner moved here to further develop helicopters and autogyros. This has a unique form of anti-torque control, because at that time he wasn't thinking of using a tail rotor, but was actually having two vanes effectively which tipped in one direction or the other, so the downdraft from the main rotor was deflected.
Okay.
It wasn't really successful. The aircraft just about got off the ground but then started tipping, so you could see what was going to happen. But later he was very successful. But again, a lot of the early helicopter development was, strangely enough, down to Sierva. although Sierva produced autogyros and passed away before helicopters got going, most of the designs had to use his patents for rotor hub control, swash plates and so on. Even people like Sikorsky couldn't control their helicopters until they actually used the Sierva patents. They didn't want to, but they had to. Mm-hmm. He was the real pioneer of rotary wing aircraft, no two ways about it. All the other pioneers were trying different methods of control, and they just didn't work. What Sierva did was develop a cyclic and collective control, which were linked, and what we call the swash plate now, which means that the rotor blades follow a pattern that you can define.
In 1929, a man by the name of Harry Pitcairn brought the autogyro to America, buying the right to license Juan de la Sierva's patents for $300,000. This is Richard Whittle, an aerospace writer who covers the rotorcraft pioneers in his book on the V-22 tiltrotor.
One of the things that I write about in my book, which was a critical development in the history of helicopters, it was the introduction in this country of a type of aircraft called the autogiro, which in the 1930s or 20s rather, was invented by a Spanish inventor named Juan de la Sierva. And this was an aircraft that had a free spinning rotor on top, which would allow it to land in short distances. And there was a businessman in the Philadelphia area named Harold Pitcairn who bought the rights to produce that kind of aircraft in the United States and was working on that and selling some. There's a really one of my favorite little bits of autogyro history is that in the movie It Happened One Night, starring Clark Gable, and I believe made in 1934, there's a scene where the bad guy in the movie, this sort of tycoon, lands his autogyro on another character's lawn. And autogyros were actually used for a while, I think, to carry mail between Philadelphia and New York. So in the 30s, Mr. Pitcairn went to his congressman and tried to get Congress to appropriate money to get the Army, which of course was the aviation service back then, to buy and develop autogyros. And after a series of hearings, that Congress actually ended up providing money for the development of any kind of rotary wing aircraft, as the rotor is called, a rotating wing.
Something new for national defense. An improved self-catapulting autogyro warms up to show military experts what it can do. The unusual whirlwing craft requires no space for a takeoff. It jumps absolutely straight up. Now being studied are its military possibilities as a flying courier and artillery spotter.
Tragically, Sierva was killed in an airliner crash in 1936, preventing him from taking his work on rotor dynamics and control to create his own helicopter.
But my guess is that by the time he was killed in an air accident, which was the result of he was flying in a fixed-wing commercial aircraft, and it was the result of a stall, which is very ironic. But by that stage, I'm absolutely convinced he was thinking about individual blade control as well. I would imagine he had grasped this idea because the collaborations that he was involved in the UK resulted in short order after his death in a helicopter that actually had that sort of control. His collaborations included Fokker in Germany, and of course Fokker went on to design and develop what's arguably the first proper working helicopter. It's quite interesting that in Germany, Flettner and Fokker both designed helicopters, and then they were both involved in autogyros as well before that, but they both designed helicopters where the torque reaction was not removed by a tail rotor. They either did it with two main rotors that were separated or two main rotors that were intermeshed. And the rotors, of course, going in different directions to counteract the torque.
The Focke-Wulf FW-61 is often considered the first practical, functional helicopter and was first flown in 1936. In February 1938, the FW-61 was even demonstrated flying indoors at a sports stadium in Berlin. We can only speculate what the FW-61 project would have led to if the Second World War had not intervened. But the success of the FW-61 as a flying machine did serve to spur on the ambitions of one young aircraft designer, a man known as Igor Sikorsky. Here is Igor's son, Sergei Sikorsky, who was kind enough to speak to us on the phone about his recollections of his father.
His love of aviation came, I believe, from the fact that his mother was very, very well developed scientifically and was very much a student of Leonardo da Vinci and also Jules Verne. She read Jules Verne's science fiction novels, and of course this inspired young Igor. And I know that my father was absolutely fascinated and read and reread that particular novel half a dozen times. And it meant it was logical, interestingly, that when he went to have a vacation with his father, Professor Sikorsky, in Berchtesgaden in Germany, he read there the very first reports of the Wright brothers flying. And that report of that flight inspired young Igor, and it was already in that very same hotel where he read the very accurate account, studied the photographs of the Wright brothers' first public demonstrations in Europe, and decided that he wanted to get into aviation.
His love of aviation cemented at a young age, Igor Sikorsky set out to be an aircraft engineer and designer. Attempts as early as 1909 to build a helicopter were unsuccessful, but the relatively inexperienced engineer showed amazing forethought to realise that the existing technology of the day wouldn't support helicopter development at that time.
In fact, he did build one or two tiny little helicopter rotors in his hotel room there in Berchtesgaden, and that was the start of his experimentation. He then left Russia briefly in, I believe, 1909, when he tried to, first of all, he went to Paris. He studied everything he could about aviation at that time. He bought a 15-horsepower Anzani engine and returned to Kiev, determined to build a helicopter. His first helicopter literally generated, as he himself put it, fascinating vibrations. It had one minor problem. It would not fly, but otherwise it was an excellent helicopter. He then built a second helicopter. This second machine could barely lift itself. Today we would say that it hovered in ground effect, in the air cushion, but it was also incapable of lifting anything besides itself. He realized at that time somehow that the helicopter was still some way away from being solved, and he took up the challenge of the fixed-wing aircraft.
For the next 10 years and throughout the First World War, Sikorsky designed scores of successful fixed-wing aircraft.
He did build a number of increasingly promising aircraft. He then became famous internationally for building and successfully test flying the world's first multi-motored and actually four-engined aircraft. It was by probably 3 times as big as anything that had been flown up to that time. There were a number of decisions that my father made when building the aircraft. And these were decisions that included a very high aspect ratio wing, which meant a very long, thin wing, sort of like what a good sailplane or glider uses today. It was the secret to his success because now, aerodynamically, we know that he never could have gotten off the ground with what we call a low aspect ratio wing. Very often, he would design his aircraft, he would help build the aircraft, and then he would test fly the aircraft. All of this was typical of those early pioneers, but it was also a very excellent school because you literally built what you would later fly. And if there were weaknesses, sometimes they caused a crash. Sometimes, quite literally, it took your life. Consequently, one learned very quickly and one learned very prudently. If one did not learn and learn prudently, one did not survive that 1910, 1912 early bloom of aviation. Dad was warned in late 17, early 18, that he was already under suspicion and would probably be executed by the Bolsheviks because of his friendship with the Tsar and because of his very great popularity. Consequently, he left Russia in January, February of 1918, never to return. He decided to come to the United States because of his deep conviction that if a small, penniless, relatively unknown immigrant came to the United States, it was because the United States was probably the only country at that time in the world that could welcome him and give him a chance to start his aviation career all over again. And that's what happened.
After emigrating to the United States in 1919 and setting up his own aircraft manufacturing company, Sikorsky decided it was time to get back into the helicopter game again. It was on a visit to Germany in 1938 to present a paper on the flying boats he was designing at that time that Igor Sikorsky saw the FW-61 in flight. He was now convinced that all the essential elements to create a successful helicopter were now in place. The race was on.
I believe, personally, that during all of this time, he kept coming back in a spare moment here or a spare afternoon there. He kept coming back to his first love, the helicopter. We know already in 1930, he was describing a potential helicopter and sending studies and memos to the chairman of the board of United Aircraft, which at that time was a large, growing aeronautical company, which by then had bought Sikorsky Aircraft. In 1938, he was able to convince the management of United Aircraft that it was time to study the helicopter actively. Part of this decision, I believe, was based on his visit to Europe and to Germany, where he saw the Focke-Gaylis FA-61 helicopter. Professor Henrik Focke had a configuration of two rotors side by side. There is no doubt that that aircraft, in my father's opinion, was the first truly successful helicopter. However, my father felt that the design of two rotors rotating in opposite directions to counteract torque was possibly a success, but not necessarily the final step.
With his company having been sold to United Aircraft and Transport Corporation in 1929, Sikorsky had to convince the United board that the time was right to invest in helicopter development, and that his helicopter design was the way to go. As his son explains, there was much scepticism at the time about the idea of using a single main rotor and single tail rotor to counter the torque. But in December 1938, he was able to convince the board to give him the go-ahead.
It was then in 1939 that he received the permission from United Aircraft Management to go ahead with his helicopter experiment. And it was severely criticized by a number of people who felt that the idea of one single main lifting rotor and an added tail rotor, a sort of rear rudder rotor, was extremely impractical. However, Mr. Sikorsky decided that this was the way to go. And despite great criticism and a lot of skepticism, he decided to go into the single rotor with small tail rotor configuration. Now, you asked me how I followed. Yes, I was growing up at that time, probably 14, 16 years of age. I watched the growth of the VS-300, one or two of the test and demonstration flights. I remember very clearly being able to stand on the legs, on the landing gear of the helicopter, and my father would lift into the air and fly me very carefully and very prudently around the field. But yes, I was standing on the landing gear of the helicopter, and I was actually flying in the machine. And those are memories that I will never, ever forget.
His design plans eventually culminated in the first tethered flight of the VS-300 helicopter on the 14th of September 1939. The first free flight occurring 8 months later on the 24th of May 1940. This success with the VS-300 led to the Sikorsky R-4. The R-4 was the world's first mass-produced helicopter and the first helicopter used by the United States Army Air Forces. Sikorsky's final VS-300 rotor configuration remains the basic design used by helicopters to this day.
By the way, later on in the very, very final configuration, the helicopter engine power was increased from 75 to 90 horsepower. Possibly on a good day, it would deliver 95 horsepower or so. At any rate, that's when they put a small rear cockpit just behind the pilot, and it can be clearly seen in some photographs, especially the photographs of the VS-300 being handed over to the Ford Museum. The technical background to the helicopter was very probably the appreciation of the lead-lag movement of the main rotor blades as the machine went through the air, and the increasing number of blades. The helicopter started with 3 blades at one time or another. The main rotor was reduced to 2 blades. Eventually, it was decided that 3 blades or even more were the way to go.
As Sergei Sikorsky explains, his father's motivation for the creation of the helicopter was clear.
Somewhere strong, very, very strongly, was his conviction that once developed, the helicopter would prove to be, in his words, a unique instrument for the saving of human lives. I think it was this vision of the helicopter as a life-saving vehicle that dominated his desire, his ambition to create the helicopter. He was obviously enamored of the idea of vertical flight, of being able to hover motionless in the air, but I think his strongest reason for developing the helicopter was his dream of the life-saving capability of the machine.
Here's Igor Sikorsky himself, speaking in 1967 as he accepted the Wright Brothers Memorial Trophy.
Now, why is it that the Wright brothers succeeded where everybody else has failed? I would say, strange as this may sound, that their approach was remarkable in their scientific and engineering common sense, truthfulness and reliability. To say the first, they realized that building a successful flying machine is only part of the thing. Learning how to fly it is the other part. We, the designers and the builders of airplanes, would be building something useless and worthless if it wouldn't be for the skill and courage of our airmen, for our airmen of the armed forces and the private pilots who made exploits that could fill not merely a volume, but could fill libraries. Of all these exploits, I would like to mention briefly just one, which is particularly valuable and particularly dear to me, which to my mind forms one of the most glorious pages of human flight. It is the story of air rescue by airplanes and lately by helicopters. In what concerns the helicopters, to my information, and I made a reasonably accurate study, the number of lives that have been saved is considerably above 100,000. It is probably reaching, possibly already exceeding 200,000 lives. Now, this is the result not merely of the ships, but mostly and mainly of the skill, ability, and courage of our flying men, all of them. And therefore, to this flying man, in completing my address, I would like to express this time my thankfulness and friendship, my deepest respect and admiration. And I thank you all.
Much in the same way as their founder, today the Sikorsky company still tracks the lives saved by their machines. This is Chris Van Booten, Vice President of Sikorsky Innovations. He says Igor Sikorsky's legacy is felt across the company to this day.
We literally feel a responsibility to carry on that innovative legacy that Igor Sikorsky had. And we've never put it on a coffee mug, but it's in our minds a lot. As we face decisions, what would Igor do? Whenever we ask ourselves that question, we know it's to have the courage to lean forward and do the next thing, and not be complacent with where we are. It's pretty neat that we've kept his office completely preserved as it was the last day he worked here, and just bringing engineers, visitors, customers to that office and seeing the spectrum of airplanes and helicopters and innovation and the people he was working with is just a constant reminder. Another simple thing we do that's right to the heart of his legacy is we keep track of how many lives our helicopters save in a given year. And we celebrate the saves by awarding pilots a Winged S pin. The Winged S was Igor Sikorsky's symbol for the company. And he was all about the ability of the helicopter to save lives.
A glimpse into the future. Sky buggies for everyone. At Fairfax, Virginia, Mr. Frank Piasecki, president of the firm which built this helicopter, is going to take her up. Simple controls are an important feature. Now manipulate a lever, release a brake, and you're off. Gaining altitude slowly and easily, literally floating on air. She's not difficult to handle either. Our pilot had only 14 hours of conventional flying time before becoming a helicopter ace. And experts say piloting can be learned in as short a time as 5 hours. When the bugs are finally combed out, Helicar will cost no more than a medium-priced automobile. Miracle of today, she's the reality of America's industrial tomorrow.
That miracle of today was the Piasecki PV-2. Designed and built by Frank Piasecki, the PV-2 is widely regarded as America's third successful helicopter, after Sikorsky's VS-300 and R-4. Developed from parts salvaged from the wreck of a light airplane, as well as automobile parts and an outdoor motor, the PV-2 took to the air for the first time in 1943. Promotional films of the PV-2 promised one for every American driveway. Indeed, Frank Piasecki had focused his initial efforts on the development of a small helicopter suitable for home and business uses, much the same vision of the other early helicopter pioneers. But the course of his work was changed dramatically after the US Navy asked for a demonstration of the PV-2. Navy chiefs had been slow to see the benefits of the helicopter. But the PV-2 impressed so much that Piasecki's company was chosen to build the prototype of a large troop-carrying helicopter. This is Frank Piasecki's son John, talking to the Royal Aeronautical Society in London.
The amazing thing about Pi was he had an approach to addressing needs that didn't use polls, didn't use market surveys. He had a very close relationship with the operational community, and he identified needs that they had before they really knew they had needs. In fact, when he first approached the Navy about a helicopter, the Navy sort of scoffed at the whole idea of vertical flight, and their response was, well, why do we need a helicopter? We don't have one now. So I think one of the first trademarks of an innovator is to see opportunity where people don't see it yet.
But while the PV-2 was unable to carry a set of golf clubs, let alone a second passenger, the Navy suddenly wanted a helicopter able to carry almost a ton of payload. Frank Piasecki's solution was the Tandem rotor configuration. This radically new configuration was made possible by his groundbreaking development of a dynamically balanced rotor system developed for the PV-2. This rotor system gave the pilot cyclic pitch control and reduced dynamic loads, opening the door for much larger and more capable helicopters. Perhaps more than any other helicopter design, the tandem rotor configuration expanded the military role of the helicopter from an aerial observation and medevac platform to one able to undertake air assault missions, anti-submarine operations, and search and rescue duties. Piasecki dubbed his new prototype the PV-3. Here's Frank Piasecki himself.
So our effective useful load of 1,900 pounds in those days was roughly 3 times the size of anything that was flying at that time. People didn't realize why that shape was, but it was because you had to have clearance in the middle of the fuselage for the rotor blade flapping. And of course, as you flew forward and you tilted the machine, the front part of the machine was level, and the rear part was up as a rear pylon.
Philadelphia, first films of the world's biggest helicopter. It's the PV-3, a revolutionary design for wingless planes. Now the Navy demonstrates the PV-3's great maneuverability for rescue at sea or transport jobs that call for pinpoint landings. Hailed as the biggest step forward in helicopter design, the PV-3 carries a record 12-passenger load. Experts say that helicopters of this design will shuttle the passengers and freight of small towns and villages to the big post-war city airports on America's main airlines. Dubbed the flying hot dog because of its strange shape, the PV-3 still flies confidently into the future of American aviation.
With two large horizontal rotor assemblies mounted one in front of the other, the tandem rotor designed by Frank Piasecki was perfect for a large cargo helicopter. The counter-rotating rotors each cancel out the other's torque, allowing all of the power from the engines to be used for lift. This is unlike single-rotor helicopters that must use some of the engine power to counter the torque created by the main rotor. Another advantage of the twin rotor design was its tolerance where the payload was placed. Piasecki's PV-3 prototype was adopted as the HRP-1 Rescuer by the United States Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. A third generation of the design, the H-21, was dubbed the Flying Banana and saw service throughout the 1950s and into the Vietnam War.
The H-21 Troop Carrier. Troop Carrier is the big twin rotor H-21. When the Vietnamese division commander schedules a strike, 10 Vietnamese soldiers with their battle equipment are allotted to each aircraft. So the total load in the H-21 is 14 personnel, including the crew. So the H-21's only emplace weapon is one .30 caliber machine gun. However, whatever armament the troop carrier has is of secondary importance.
More than 700 H-21s were eventually produced for service worldwide. Frank Piasecki and his team at the Piasecki Helicopter Corporation designed and built 10 separate helicopters from 1943 to 1953. Each new design contributed to the rapid evolution of vertical flight technology at the time. But Frank Piasecki, the innovator, was to come up against the classic corporate struggle. Investors wanted the company to concentrate on the production of the established models rather than expend efforts creating new designs. In 1955, Frank Piasecki left the company he founded to start Piasecki Aircraft. Piasecki Helicopter in turn was renamed VTOL Corporation the following year, before itself being acquired by Boeing in 1960 and becoming Boeing VTOL. The move left Frank Piasecki free to pursue new vertical flight technologies.
You go 5 forward and 4 back, and you don't make one slow step, you make a whole bunch of jabs to solve problems, and you don't always hit the right solution. So we said, okay, let's not do anything with the tandem because that's been fairly well established, and so let's not fight against ourselves.
Here's John Piasecki again, speaking in London.
It's emblematic of a passion that is too rare these days. You know, the thing when I look back on my father's career that most strikes me is you really had to love what you were doing in order to take the risks that they took. You know, in today's world, we manage our huge aerospace projects with IPTs and sophisticated management processes, and as you could see by the flight safety policies they had in the beginning days, there was a lot of personal courage involved. I remember one time we were at some big public function, and and somebody came up to Dad and said, "Frank Piasecki, it's a pleasure to meet a real pioneer." And as we were walking away, my dad turned to me and he said, "John, you know what a pioneer is?" He said, "Just like in the Old West, the pioneer is the guy with all the arrows in his rear end." So the important thing, and I think it's a lesson I think we can take from his life, is that innovation isn't something that one gets by going into a white room and imagining fantastic new ideas. Innovation is built by years of hard work and fighting towards an ultimate goal and failing more than you succeed by persevering. So perseverance is one of those things that I think in many cases probably trumps brains. I know in my case it does. It's a lesson that I learned from my father, and I hope to live well by it.
Today, Piasecki Aircraft Corporation specialises in the design, development and flight testing of experimental rotorcraft and unmanned air vehicles. The company's focus has remained steadfast on research and development. More recently, the Piasecki X-49 Speedhawk experimental high-speed compound helicopter helped demonstrate the company's vectored thrust ducted propeller design. John Piasecki outlines the company's approach to innovation.
I think one of the first trademarks of an innovator is to see opportunity where people don't see it yet. The second part of innovation, I think that's very important, is that it has to be done within a small group of very diverse talents. In fact, if you look at our staff, our engineers also work out in the shop as instrumenting things, or they work on the flight line. So we get a multidisciplinary approach to problems that in larger companies gets broken up into departments. And it allows for very rapid problem solving and allows you to take advantage of the experience of the mechanic early on in the design. And allows you to do things a lot quicker. Building things quicker and then getting them through tests in a very cost-effective manner is critical to being able to do projects in an affordable fashion. Today, we don't have these innovative programs as much as we should because there are real problems out there because the cost of doing them the normal way is so prohibitive. So I think we need to take a lesson from the past in this regard. You know, if you look at the first tandem helicopter, most people don't believe it, but that was flown from contract signing to first flight was 13 months. It's incredible. We can do that today. We can do that today. It's just that our systems don't allow for it. Our procurement systems don't allow for it. Our risk averseness doesn't allow for it. Not that I'm propounding abandoning risk management, but we have to have an educated risk and risk tolerant approach if we're going to do things new. We didn't get where we are today by living in a risk-free environment, particularly aviation.
Testament to Frank Piasecki's approach is that his designs were able to sustain not one but two helicopter companies over the years. Boeing's CH-46 Sea Knight was in service for more than 50 years until being retired by the US Marine Corps in 2015. Meanwhile, the CH-47 Chinook has racked up 57 years of service with the US Army and is still going strong. The distinctive sound of the Chinook helicopter is one monument to Frank Piasecki's ingenious tandem rotor design. As Frank Piasecki was developing his early helicopter designs, no more than 20 miles down the road in rural Pennsylvania, the work of another pioneer was about to further revolutionise the helicopter movement. And with it, the future fortunes of the Bell Aircraft Corporation. From building helicopter models in his parents' barn to the creation of the iconic Bell 47, Arthur M. Young was set to take his place alongside the other fathers of the helicopter. That's next time on Revolutions in Vertical Flight. Revolutions in Vertical Flight is brought to you in partnership with Bell, a huge thanks for their support. Thanks also to the Royal Aeronautical Society, the Vertical Flight Society and the Arthur Young Society for their assistance and access to their archives, as well as to Elfyn ap Rhys and the staff at the Helicopter Museum. The speech by Igor Sikorsky was used under license from the Igor Sikorsky Historical Archives Incorporated. In our research, we found The God Machine by James Childs extremely helpful, and it's an excellent read. Revolutions in Vertical Flight was written and produced by Tony Skinner, with script assistance by Jared Cowan and audio edits by Noemi Di Stefano. And I'm your narrator, Jennifer Beckwan.